Sorry guys, but we're not getting an N64 Mini. Yo, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we're talking about the N64 Mini and why it's not happening. Everybody knows that during the Wii U, Nintendo made an ingenious decision and decided to create the Super Nintendo Mini, as well as the Super Nintendo Mini Classic, as they would call it. This was an item that just came out at such a perfect time, especially for Nintendo, as well as gaming as a whole. All these different types of clone consoles, and all the different ways that you can emulate every game that's ever come out for pretty much every system ever. There's some way that you can pretty much play that game. So it came out right at a perfect time when Nintendo was pretty much at its worst, because they had the Wii U. That wasn't really much to fall back on. The thing was selling terribly. Everybody knows it. The thing bombed straight out the gate. They weren't making money. Even some of their employees, such as like the Nintendo president, had gone on record saying that they were even taking salary cuts because Nintendo just wasn't pulling in the revenue that they needed to sustain their company that they were used to. So they made the ingenious decision. So they made the NES and SNES Classic mini consoles. People wanted them. It just blew up online everywhere. Pre-orders were full up. Stores were completely out. Launch day came. Nobody could get their hands on them. And then we see them all over eBay, all over Craigslist, going for ridiculous prices. So after that, after those came and went, after people got their hands on them, the Wii U just fizzled out, and the rumored NX came up on the horizon. As we know, the Nintendo Switch came out of the gate, started selling ridiculous, and has gone on to be the best-selling system possibly of all time. Not just the best system, because it's not actually the most sold yet, but it is selling the fastest out of any console ever, which shouldn't be a surprise with how popular gaming is and with how many more people there are today than there was back in the 1990s. A year into the Nintendo Switch being out, people want to know, where is the Nintendo 64 Classic mini console from Nintendo? And to this day, people are still wondering, people are still questioning, people are still writing on Twitter about it, people are still commenting, hoping for a chance that Nintendo will come out with the Nintendo 64 Mini. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's just not happening. I think it's safe to say we are not getting a Nintendo 64 Mini. There's just a few reasons pretty much to go over why. I would say timing and the library of games for the NES as well as the Super Nintendo Classic have a lot to do with how they set the system up and the way that the thing came out and was actually received. When it comes to the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, both of them have a look that has not aged poorly at all, with them being 2D systems, 2D graphics from the mid to late 80s and early 90s. The graphics and the games and the quality of them and the sound and the gameplay and just the whole kind of aura around the games themselves have aged incredibly well as opposed to 3D gaming. So I'm just gonna say that those games just look better than any 3D games when 3D games first started coming out. Nintendo was really on their game, and the NES and Super Nintendo have gone just stratospheric in terms of their accolade and the love that people have for them, just the way they look, the games from all the Marios to Metroid to Zelda. All those games have aged incredibly well. And more so for the Nintendo Classic Mini than the Super Nintendo Classic Mini. Nintendo was basically making all the big first-party games. When you look at the lineup for the Nintendo Classic Mini, all those games are Nintendo first-party, barely any third-party, no licensed stuff. When you get to the Super Nintendo Classic, it's the same thing. It's all Nintendo's first-party games, and they're all just killer lineups for the most part. There's a few exceptions and a few games that people don't like as much that they would have rather had something else, like on the Super Nintendo Classic. People would have rather had Chrono Trigger versus maybe the Kirby All-Stars, and that just comes down to personal preference, but also comes down to money! It always comes down to money, as I've said in previous videos. It always boils down to money. And when you look at the Nintendo 64 library, the games have aged sort of okay, somewhat poorly, but really I think the biggest thing is when the Wii U was out, a lot of these games that Nintendo made are still on the Wii U Virtual Console. Now, even though we don't have that on the Switch still, you could go that route to get those games to actually play them. Now, I'm just like anybody else. I would love to have a Super Nintendo Mini that's a actual release from Nintendo. That would be completely great, but it comes down to, I think, the cost of what the thing would be and the game lineup. We also have the fact that the Nintendo and Super Nintendo were both two-player. For the most part, all the games were two players. They were able to pack two controllers in with both the systems. So that goes without saying that that's great. The Nintendo 64 is much more of a four-player type of system. Now, not all games need that. Most games could be fine with two players or even just the single-player games. But when you look at all these games, Nintendo has kind of already re-resurrected them and given them a lot of love. So we're gonna go over the list here kind of what the games would be that would be first party, because let's face it, a lot of the Nintendo 64 stuff that isn't first party Nintendo, it most likely wouldn't be on the system. It would be cut from it. There's too much licensing that they would have to do, too many documents probably to go back through to figure out who holds all the rights to these, who would have to get paid, and all those type of logistics, which I'm sure would be a nightmare for something like GoldenEye 007. Let's face it, that would be a game that would need to be on the console. That is a game that represents the Nintendo 64 just as much as Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Banjo and Kazooie, Super Smash Bros., etc. So when you think of the Nintendo 64 and the first party games, you have Paper Mario, which has never been re-released or really shown much love. It's on the Wii U Virtual Console. They never touched it up. They never put it out again on something like the DS or the 3DS, which they did do. They did do a remake, and they did revitalize both The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. So we would also have stuff like Mario Tennis and Mario Golf. Hopefully Super Smash Bros., which I don't know if that would be Nintendo's decision or how that would actually work, or if that would even be a game that they would want to put on it. I think something like that is kind of bigger than itself, and I'm not necessarily certain that they would put it on there. Hell, it's not even on the Wii U Virtual Console, and that's a game I would love to see come back. I'd love to see them go back and make the game online, or even do a re-release, whether they touched up the graphics or not, or just sort of smoothed it out, make it online, add some gameplay elements, but that's not what we're talking about here. Let's continue with the list. You would have Donkey Kong 64, which by most people's standard and regards, not the best game. I still think it holds a lot of nostalgia for people, and people would love to play that, so that would be a game that would more than likely be on a Nintendo 64 Classic. You'd also have Pokemon Snap, hopefully. I'm not sure what that would actually entail, but Yoshi's Story. Pretty good game. I never actually played it, but a lot of people would love to see that. You got Kirby 64, the Crystal Shards. That's also a great game. You got things like Wave Race 64, Mario Kart 64, F-Zero X. Those are all great games, great standout titles, and pretty much the meaning of what the Nintendo 64 actually is. Then you got other stuff like 1080 snowboarding, you got Excite Bike 64. That's personally one of my favorites. I don't think a lot of people would actually care about that. We get to Star Fox 64. Both Mario Kart 64 and F-Zero are still on the Wii U Virtual Console, and that's why having a Wii U in this day and age where the Switch doesn't have a Virtual Console is still vital to me as a gamer, and it still has a lot of value as a Nintendo fan. So if I was you, I would get yourself a Wii U, because I don't see the N64 Classic happening. There would hopefully also be Mario Party, Mario Party 2, but those titles just kind of seem to roll over, and though a lot of people's favorite Mario Party usually for the most part happens to be Mario Party 1 through 4, and then a select few others like 5 and 6. I never followed too much Mario Party, but I would love to see all those games on a Nintendo 64 Classic Mini. And Super Mario 64, of course, which has been remade. It's on the DS. Both the original N64 emulation and the Nintendo DS remake emulation are both on the Wii U Virtual Console as well. People would probably also want things like Mischief Makers or Castlevania 64 or even Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. Both of those games are pretty much universally hated and shit on in the Castlevania community. But again, they're just more N64 games that you would hope would be on the console, but I don't think with Konami that they would end up. Harvest Moon 64, things like Rayman 2, Mega Man 64. You also have Bomberman 64 or Bomberman 64 The Second Attack. Now, outside of most of those other games, the only other ones that I really think of are like Rare. So we're talking about GoldenEye, we're talking about Banjo and Kazooie, we're talking about Conker's Bad Fur Day. People have recommended that instead of putting 007, which would probably be a nightmare going back and trying to figure out all the logistics. When you do a game based on a movie, the way all those things tie in together, that instead of doing GoldenEye 007, you would probably want to put Perfect Dark. But that basically for the 4-player multiplayer shooting game, it would be better to have Perfect Dark on the system as opposed to GoldenEye. That's just a list of the games that most people would want on it. But then when you think about all the great third-party games, chances are those wouldn't happen, as well as other licensed games. You have stuff like sports games, other racing games. There weren't barely any RPGs. That's why I mentioned Harvest Moon 64. There's no RPGs barely on the Nintendo 64. So that's a big downer as well. And this was when 3D gaming was just first happening. And a lot of these games didn't age really that well. They're still on the Wii U Virtual Console. So that's one way to get them. But in terms of 3D consoles, a lot of these games didn't really age that well. Other titles that I would want to see is stuff like Cruisin' USA, or maybe California Rush, or even Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. That's right, it's not actually called Star Wars Pod Racing, but that would be another title that you would hope to see on there. It's a third-party game, and I just wouldn't see a title like that being on the Nintendo 64 Classic. So I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but the Nintendo 64 Classic isn't coming, at least not anytime soon. The reason that Nintendo did it, and they basically said it, and I don't understand why people haven't heard it loud and clear, but when they did the Nintendo Classic Mini, that was a stopgap. They weren't making money. The Wii U was bombing. They needed a console that was cheap to make, would sell a lot, so they went with the Nintendo. They grabbed all their best games. They did it for a reasonable price, if you weren't paying scalper prices, that is. But if you bought it from the store, you got a great collection of games, and it wasn't too expensive, and it was a great deal, honestly. And then we had the Nintendo Switch coming out, and it was the same thing. They did the Super Nintendo. It had 10 less games on it, but the quality of the games were probably higher. The Super Nintendo Classic is one of the best systems that you could go out there today and buy. It's one of the best values in gaming for your money. You could go and buy one single game for like $60, or you could put up the same amount of money and get yourself a Super Nintendo Classic. So Nintendo was hurting at that point. The Switch was just on the brink of coming out, and they put out the Super Nintendo Classic, and they started making all this money. Between those systems, they've sold probably over 10 million at least. So it was a stopgap, a way to make money. Reggie Fils-Aimé, he said that those were not our plans coming on the horizons. And then there was also the whole thing with the patent for the N64 controller. It was basically going to be a Nintendo 64 Classic, and it sort of seems like that in one way, but in another way it just seems like it was them securing the future if they ever decide to do the N64 Mini. So even though they did the patent for the controller, it makes sense to have the patent at least on it. Now in the future, yeah, it might be a patent for a wireless controller that is for the Switch if they happen to put Nintendo 64 games. So do I think Nintendo is coming out with an N64 Classic Mini? I'm gonna say no. I don't think that they actually are going to be doing that. So I hate to burst your bubble. This has kind of just been a long form rant. And I had another part of the video that kind of got scrapped, so here I am coming back after the fact in the future, and I'm kind of just done with the video, so these are just my random thoughts. What do you think? Do you think we're getting an N64 Classic Mini? I personally don't. I wish they would, but it seems like a lot to go through, mainly for the fact that it wouldn't have third-party support. I think Nintendo, they're just gonna wait it out, and then on Nintendo Switch Online, basically just put the first-party games on there, as well as similar thing for the GameCube. I don't think they're gonna take a chance with any of their older games until they absolutely have to. Should there in the future be a situation like the Wii U, where they're just doing terrible financially, they're not selling product, I think that would be the time when they would unleash an N64 Mini or a Game Boy Classic or even a GameCube. But Nintendo is in a place where a lot of their older games, at least for the NES and SNES, put out in several other different ways, whether it's the Wii U Virtual Console or some of these collections or the NES, SNES Classic Mini. There's a bunch of ways to play these games, and those games honestly hold up much better than a lot of the N64 games. So anyways, I had a further part to this video that ended up getting cut. The file got corrupted and it kind of disappeared. I was going to be able to do something with it, and after my computer, I turned it off, and I'm coming back to it now. The file's gone, so I'm kind of just ending this video. It was kind of just sporadic ranting, and probably not my best video that I've ever put out. So I tried to make a decent ending to it. Once again, I don't think the N64 Classic Mini is going to be a thing, unfortunately, nor do I think a GameCube or a Game Boy Classic. are going to be coming from Nintendo. They're just in a much better place now, and I don't think they have to fall back on that nostalgia like they did after the Wii U flopped when they decided to make the NES and SNES Classic. Subscribe if you would like to, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Have a very nice day. Yeah, D-Dub, YouTube. Turn my headphones up. What? Come on. Yeah, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, you know what I'm saying? Cheer.